The meeting's not live?
Mr. Chairman, we are live and recording, and you may gavel in the meeting when ready.
Thank you. Good morning. The open meeting of the Federal Election Commission for February 29th, 2024 will come to order. We have a short agenda today. And as I understand it, no special motions are needed. So I'll say that the Audit Division recommendation memo on 1199 SEIU United has been resolved on tally. So the only item on our agenda today is draft advisory opinion 2024-01, which is Texas Majority PAC. We have Ms. Bird from the Office of General Counsel here. We also have counsel for the requester, Mr. Birkin, and Ms. Mahmood. If you want to go ahead and come on up, please, and make yourselves available, we would appreciate it. Thank you so much. And if OGC could, this isn't the first time we've seen this issue, but it's the first time for under this request number. So maybe if you could give us a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Commissioners. Before you are agenda documents 2408A and 2408B, which are draft responses to an advisory opinion request from Texas Majority PAC. The requester asked several questions regarding its proposal to hire vendors to canvass potential voters, namely whether canvassing literature and scripts and their associated costs are public communications, coordinated communications, or coordinated expenditures, and whether the requester can provide data acquired during the canvass to a federal candidate or party committee at less than fair market value. Draft A concludes that the canvassing literature and scripts are public communications and coordinated communications. The cost to produce and distribute the communications are not coordinated expenditures because they are for coordinated communications. Draft A further concludes that if the requester provides the data acquired during its paid canvass to a federal candidate or party committee at less than its fair market value, it will result in an in-kind contribution to the candidate or party committee. Draft B concludes that the canvassing literature and scripts are not public communications and as a result are not coordinated communications. Further, the cost to produce and distribute the canvassing literature and scripts are not coordinated expenditures because they are for communications. Finally, Draft B concludes that if the requester provides the data acquired during its paid canvass to a federal candidate or party committee at less than its fair market value, it will result in an in-kind contribution to the candidate or party committee. The Commission received 2 comments on the request and 3 comments on the draft. Thank you, and we're available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bird, and thank you, Mr. Bergen and Ms. Mahmood, for being here again. Colleagues, I'll open it up first for any questions for OGC or for counsel for the requesters. Let me go ahead and start then. First, let me just say that to counsel for the requesters that my appreciation, my thanks for the great advocacy, frankly, that's been done throughout this advisory opinion request as well as the previous one. I have found your very rapid response to other comments to be very helpful. And I appreciate you bearing with us, frankly, through what's been a long AO process. And I understand why you withdrew the previous one and resubmitted, but I think it's been very helpful to the Commission as we sort of grapple with what is a very sort of cutting edge issue and an innovative view of the law. And I found it very helpful. My first question, I guess, is, there's been a lot of written back and forth. We've also gotten what I found to be some very interesting and helpful comments from just outside observers, from members of the bar and people who represent other sort of interested parties in that, Mr. Neil Reef and Mr. Lawrence Gold. And I guess I first ask if you have any response to those comments that have come in and the sort of perspective they've brought us. I mean, most of their comments focus on the first part of the question, which is the public communication aspect of it, not so much the subsidiary analysis that follows from it.
Thank you, Chairman, for your kind words. And we've also found it to be a very informative process to kind of go through this. I think we got a lot of very good feedback the last time, and hopefully our request this time presents the question in a more precise way that allows for an answer and informs the entire regulated community. I also found the comments to be quite helpful, and I think they underscore a few points. The first is that this type of activity has been viewed by the regulated community and its advocates as a distinct form of grassroots advocacy that is very different from general public political advertising. It is something it's really probably one of the older forms of political communication. I think as Mr. Gold indicated that it's probably compared to those forms of communication that are enumerated in the definition of public communication, only a newspaper may be older. We'll have to go to historians to determine whether newspapers or door-to-door advocacy is older. And so this really is a form of communication that is very different from the types of mediums that are described in 100.26 and in the statutory definition of public communication. And the reason for it, I think, as Mr. Gold and Mr. Reif lay out, is that this really is a form of one-on-one communication, not a mass public communication. Yes, it's obviously an aggregation of one-on-one communication, but it really is a form of one-on-one communication. And it's one where the recipient of the communication really has a choice whether to engage with the canvasser on that conversation or not. I was actually thinking back this morning as I was reading through everything when we were, I think it was in October before the Virginia elections, when there was a ton of communication for those of us who live in Virginia. And my kids are on their iPads and they're being fed digital ads about all of these races, right? And those come right into your screen. That's not a form of communication that you have any opportunity to engage. And then we have people, come to our doors, right? And most of the time I do what I do engage them. But you really have the choice, right? To, either not answer the doorbell, and you have the choice to say, look, I'm not interested. Please don't leave anything, leave away. Or you have a choice to engage in a one-on-one conversation. That really does distinguish the form of communication. I think the other point that was quite persuasive that Mr. Gold and Mr. Reid put forth is that analytically, what's interesting about draft A and draft B is how close they are to one another. We really do agree on almost every point, including the framework by which to judge the ultimate question. And it seems like the main point of difference between A and B is A seems to conclude that if you use a vendor, you are engaged in a public community. And B tries to distinguish between a vendor and what we call an intermediary, or what's been described in the past as a platform controlled by a third party. And I think as Mr. Gold and Mr. Reif lay out, nobody in the regulated community or any of its advocates have ever understood the hiring of a vendor per se to be the distinction between a public communication and something other than a public communication. And the reasons for that are obvious. One, if that really were the rule, you could just hire everyone as employees. And two, that's just never been anything that the FEC has come in to try to distinguish between, right? Whether it's an employer or vendor, maybe a question of employment law, or maybe a question of convenience, but it's not the key that distinguishes a public communication from something other than a public communication. So I thought they really hit those points home in a very persuasive way.
Thank you for that. No, that's very helpful. I guess, it's not necessarily in the drafts themselves, but in a lot of the comments, there was sort of discussion of what you were talking about of trying to analytically understand, as you said, the difference between, say, a vendor as an agent of the committee versus an intermediary or someone who controls a channel or a platform or something like that. And I was thinking about that because it's important. We're thinking about not just your request, but trying to form a universalizable principle, right, that could be applied in future advisory opinion requests if people have other forms of. I think I mentioned back in October, you could imagine other proposals on things like rallies or soapboxes on street corners or things like that. And people might have requests about that. And, trying to think of what is the principle that underlies the distinctions between, say, the specific categories in the public communications reg and then the general public political advertising, things like that. On the point about, looking at whether an intermediary is used, I wanted to ask one sort of hypothetical about that, because I think the way I'm thinking about this, and I don't think this will really drive the drafts, is that really it should be just looked at sort of a categorical view of the kind of communication. Is it a face-to-face personalized opt-in kind of communication or not? And whether you hire a vendor or not may actually not be relevant. So I mean, let me ask, the hypothetical I came up with is, suppose your client wanted to lease a plot of land next to the highway and get a contractor and build their own sign and put it up next to the highway and make the equivalent of their own billboard, right? They're not renting it from a billboard company. They're not leasing it. They just did it all themselves. You know, an outdoor advertising facility is listed as one of the specific examples of a public communication. There's no intermediary, right? You own it as the committee. Would that be a public communication nonetheless?
I think it would be in part, as you indicated, because it is one of the enumerated factors. And I think the way you are describing it is quite helpful, because I think the intermediary is essentially, at least as we've been able to do the analysis and think through the different communications, at some level is a proxy for whether or not this is kind of a mass form of communication versus more of a one-on-one, whether it's an opt-in in the sense we use for text messages, or the kind of personalized communication in which the potential recipient has a clear opportunity to essentially just walk away with their feet or ask people to step away from it. So I agree that, it's a very interesting hypothetical, because you kind of maybe end run the need for a facility, but I think we can analogize to circumstances in which this has historically been something for which you would need some form of intermediary to access someone's platform. And in this case, I think that clearly would be a public communication.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, with respect to speaking for myself, the way I think about general public political advertising is as two elements, which is the general public. And I think that was really what was driving the Maggie for New Hampshire AO, right? It wasn't the general public because people had opted into those communications, and then advertising, right? It has to be a form of political advertising directed at the general public. And if one of those two things is missing, it doesn't fall within that definition. But thank you for that. I'll open it up for colleagues. Before I do, I'll say just very quickly that I expect commissioners are going to want more time to see if there are other comments that come in. We have a little bit more time, so I apologize for maybe making you appear twice, but I'm expecting we're not going to be able to vote today because I think people are going to want more time to consider these drafts or any edits or things like that. So
we're very close by. No inconvenience.
I appreciate that, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're distinguishing, well, let me back up and say welcome. Always a pleasure. You're distinguishing this kind of grassroots door-to-door advocacy from mass communications. But how do you distinguish it from phone banks, which are plainly covered? And it seems to me present pretty much the same description that you just used. People have the option whether they're going to answer the phone or not answer the phone. They can hang up at any time. There's, and I'm not talking about robocalls. I'm talking about actual human beings on the phone. There's an opportunity to engage and have individual conversations, although in both the door knocking case and the phone bank situation, they start out with a script that's, pre-written for them. Seems, and let me say up front that I think the distinction you make between employees and vendors is an important one, and it's one that I've been thinking about a lot. But how do you distinguish door knocking from phone banks?
I think it's a great question. I think there are two important factors. One is, again, I do want to focus on the text of the statute and then the implementing regulation, which does enumerate telephone banks. So at some level, it was a congressional choice. And clearly, Congress at the time that they defined public communication, the commission, when it promulgated 100.26, was well aware of both forms of communications and chose to enumerate one and not the other. And I think that distinction is important. And again, I think it goes back to a question about needing some sort of third-party facility. And certainly the history of telephone banks, obviously we live in a different time now. But when Congress, passed DICRA and when the commission implemented, I think certainly it was at least in the public minds about a telephone bank that it probably involved some sort of landline. Now that's anachronistic, but certainly you had to have some sort of both parties, whether it's the caller or the recipient, had some relationship with that intermediary, right? You are a subscriber, you have a telephone, you pay telephone service in order to be able to receive those calls. And so there is the need to go through that utility essentially to deliver the message. And I think that is the key analytical distinction. I think it informs probably why Congress and the commission made the choices that it did.
Thank you. I think there's a further analogy to mass mailings, right? Which is that only the postal service is legally allowed to put something in your mailbox. People, will do it anyway, but in theory, they're the only facility, they're the only channel through which and you have a mailbox, you are allowed to receive things through the mail through that way. And that makes it a little bit different than, say, as you said, people knocking to try to talk to you. Maybe no one answers. Maybe they leave something on your door hanger or something like that. Like Vice Chair.
They could also put something in your mailbox. I mean, if somebody was walking around and the postal service, and I know this from personal experience, are not the only people who can put things in your mailbox.
Well, we could look into this, but my understanding is that legally you're not actually supposed to put, if you're not a member of the postal service, you're not supposed to be putting things in other people's mailboxes.
I will vouch for that. When we advise canvassers, we always tell them do not put anything. And it has always been our understanding that is a violation of federal law to put it in the mailbox. I agree it happens, but I think it is technically not allowed, is my understanding. But I'm not an expert in that.
Colleagues, any other questions for OGC or for Requesters Council? Commissioner Lindenbaum.
Thank you. And I will follow up on and agree with you all there that it is also my understanding that it would be a violation of federal law. And I've seen many instructions to canvassers that included to put it in the mailbox, and we always struck it. So on that note, I don't have any questions. I do just want to reiterate on what the chair said, and something that I said a couple of weeks ago is that giving us this kind of time and not putting these kinds of AOs on the expedited lane gives us time to really formulate this, ask questions, work with our counsel's office, and most importantly get these comments in that have been incredibly helpful. So this is how we work best. And to everyone who has submitted comments or is considering still submitting comments on this one or any future AOs, please do so. They are just incredibly helpful for us.
Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, anything else? Okay, seeing nothing. My thanks very much to OGC. My thanks very much to Requesters Council. We are going to hold this over till the next open meeting, and which will be our last open meeting in which to consider this before the 60-day deadline. But thank you very much. And again, I underscore what Commissioner Lindenbaum said. To those listening, if there are other comments, please get them in. They are read, they are considered, they're valued. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
That exhausts the only substantive item on our agenda. So let me ask Mr. Staff Director, are there any management or administrative matters for consideration today?
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you so much. This open meeting is adjourned.
Stand by.